Welcome to Innovations in Education. I'm your host, David Adams, CEO of the Urban Assembly. And on this show, we bring guests every single episode who have made things work in public education. This show is about the innovators. This show is about the folks who are solving problems. This show is about making things work in education. Now, there's a lot of shows out there talking about what's wrong in the education systems, and those are great shows. There's some shows talking about what we're not doing well, and there's a lot to learn from those, but that's not this show. This show is going to be featuring educators who are making things work for young people and improving public education. Today, I am joined by Alex Kotran. Alex, you oversee the strategy, partnerships, fundraising, and external relations for the AI Education Project. Prior to founding the AI Education Project, you built the AI ethics and corporate social responsibility function for H5 Inc., pioneering AI company in the legal services sector. At H5, you led strategic partnerships with organizations including the United Nations, NYU School of Law, the OECD, and the IEEE to develop judicial education programs and high-profile convenings. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Alex, you sound like you have a little bit of a background in artificial and intelligence. Tell me about how AI EDU came to be under your leadership.
Yeah, it's funny. I would say that I have a background in AI ethics and sort of like intersection of AI and society. I'm not a technologist. And I think that's actually really important to call out. My background's in politics, my career after college in political organizing for the Obama reelection campaign, and then doing Obamacare and Ebola, sort of like in state level engagement. But I think that was actually really relevant, sort of the origin story of AI EDU. It's a long story that I'll spare you, but I think the short, maybe the most important piece is I was in Silicon Valley. I was doing work for AI companies focused on AI ethics. And what I noticed is that, it was a bunch of techies talking amongst themselves about this technology that they were convinced was going to transform the world. And I would be looking around the room and I'm just like, I'm an Ohio kid. My parents are both educators. I'm not a techie. And it was really stark to me, just sort of like hearing these conversations and feeling like, all these people that are supposedly going to be impacted by this game changing technology aren't in the room. And we're talking about how we're going to help them. And it's like, I want to hear about how they're going to be a part of this solution. And so, AIEDU that was sort of the origin of even this idea of like, well, why should everybody learn about artificial intelligence? You know, Initially it was like, because that's the only way they're going to have an opportunity to be at the table. And then obviously, since then, this is 5 years ago. I mean, I think if you had asked me 5 years ago, how long would it take for us to experience what happened over the last 18 months, the explosion of large language models into sort of the public domain and generative AI and art and, the ability to simulate physical environments and, mind reading technology, like all this stuff, I would have said, oh yeah, that stuff is probably, at the end of the decade. So it surprised me along with, I think, most folks in the space. And so now we're kind of like, as I think are you, sort of just, I feel like we're either riding the wave or caught in the wave. I don't, one of the two, but it's been exciting and just mind expanding.
Well, if I'm riding the wave, then I would say our educators are the surfboard, right? Because they're helping stabilize the UA and also informing. And you said something really important, Alex, because I gotta say, I'm pretty sure AI has been the first time technologists have developed solutions for education space without having educators in a room. This has never happened before in the history of education before AI. Am I rocking that right? This is a unique thing to the AI movement.
I mean, there are wiser people than me who can opine about ed tech, but I think that actually it's often observed to me, right, that ed tech very, very frequently doesn't include educators, at the core and always, to its own folly. And so I think, I mean, the internet, I think that we actually have a history as a nation of undervaluing educators, broadly
Mhm,
speaking.
mhm.
And sure, I'm biased. My mom is a math teacher and, I see how hard she works. And I obviously have this kind of obsession with the idea of educators really being our secret weapon in all of this is like, you know, technology isn't going to solve all these problems for us. It's going to create lots of problems. I think teachers are really going to solve, they're going to come in to save the day. And yeah, I think, the surfboards, they're also the surf instructors,
Mhm,
I don't think we'd know how to surf if we didn't have educators actually telling us like, this is what teaching and learning looks
yeah.
like when it's successful.
I
But
I
yeah,
can see
just
where
profound respect. And again, like AIED was all about how do we make sure educators are like at the center of this work
Yeah.
because, they're not only part of the solution in terms of the delivery of sort of AI literacy and, getting students ready for the future, but they're also going to help us kind of figure out what the future of teaching and learning looks like. Uh,
Hmm.
and I'm sure
So
you experience this in your day to day because you work so closely with educators.
I just literally came from a school today where we're working with teachers thinking about the work we're doing around Project Cafe, which is going to be our teacher feedback tool, working with American Institutes of Research and Teachstone. And we were just talking with them to start to think about like what problems can we think about? What ways can we organize information to help support the teaching and learning process? So yeah, I mean, I'm very resonant with what you're talking about here about the importance of designing with our educators, right? So that the tools are relevant to the problems that they're trying to work on. I wanted to take a little bit of time to think about this idea of the journey of AI and education. So you kind of talked us through a little bit of it more broadly. You talked about generative AI models, large language models. You talked about image processing. You talked about, I assume, this new AI model that allows us to create actual videos and coming out of OpenAI. What has been this trajectory of the capabilities of AI and how they've been relevant to the education space?
AI has been around since the term since like the 1950s. It really picked up in the mid 2010s. There was sort of this confluence of, cloud computing availability and just sort of like overall compute and, you know, bigger and bigger data sets. And so, machine learning is something that, I mean, I don't know if it was specific to education, but it's sort of in general, there was a lot of, applications of machine learning that, were probably transformational in their own sort of niche. So if you're doing sort of like, analysis of student data, I can't really name those specific tools. It's a bit before our time, but, no doubt that there's lots of tools that schools were and probably continue to leverage that are using sort of a less exciting, but probably equally, if not more impactful flavor of artificial intelligence, which is, yeah, machine learning. But then there was this moment, in 2017, a paper came out called Attention is All You Need, and it really sort of laid out the transformer model, which is basically sort of like what underpins large language models and all of this like sort of generative artificial
Wait,
intelligence.
we're talking Optimus Prime here?
We are not talking Optimus Prime,
Okay.
but it is, you could tell if someone's like sort of nerding out because they'll talk about the transformer and how big of a game changer it was. For your listeners, like what I would say is basically this unlocked the flavor of what is effectively just really advanced text prediction. And what's interesting about this is, you know, large language models, and I still struggle to really wrap my head around this, but large language models are not an invention per se. Because
Mhm,
you invent something, you kinda know what it's gonna do. Like, you invent a microwave or you invent, an engine or something, and it does that thing that you'd invented it to do. With large language model, that's more like looking through a telescope and discovering a new planet or a new galaxy.
mm,
And as we get more sophisticated telescopes, we start to learn more and more things about this this thing. And, it's been described in some ways as like sort of alien intelligence that we're kind of like encountering. So what does that actually mean? It's kind of hard to understand. The journey of AI in education is tied to this journey of like large language models and sort of like the step change in their capability. So as you train these models and as the compute gets bigger and as the data sets get bigger, what you'll see is these sort of like step change in capabilities and new capabilities that weren't planned called emergent capabilities, right?
mm,
So the example that I often use is like, there was a large language model that scientists were training. And then at a certain point, the data set got big enough that it was able to translate Farsi into
mhm,
English without having ever seen a single word of Farsi in the data set. And like we to this day do not understand how or why that happened. And
mm.
so we're kind of along for the ride in a way.
So what's the
Yeah,
surfboard? 'Cause we're gonna ride this analogy to the end of this show, by the way, that
we're
so
gonna ride this analogy.
we're along for the ride, and what's stabilizing us? What's giving us a sense of direction and purpose so that we're looking cool rather than being overtaken?
I mean, I think, let's just sort of like beat this analogy to death. But I think, teachers as a surfboard is really interesting because, what will continue to happen and what has been happening is all these new capabilities are just sort of like exploding onto the scene. And we're,
Mm,
dealing with it. We have like AI tutors, and pretty soon we're going to have avatars that are going to be able to have conversational, do conversational mentorship for kids one on one. And maybe, the example I was, I'm from Akron, Ohio. So I'm like, what if you could have LeBron James helping you with your math homework? I mean, there's going to be all this stuff that's just really interesting.
I don't know,
Um,
LeBron James, though, Alex,
I mean,
is he known for his calculations?
well, I mean, but But if you think about like, okay, how can we use AI to actually reach the kids who, are otherwise maybe going to be left behind? It's like we can use AI to really engage
Mhm,
kids that, don't necessarily opt into learning in the same way. And so
mhm,
I use the LeBron James analogy because it's like, maybe having, sports stars that kids really look up to could be a way to actually get them to pay attention to their math homework. That's not
mhm,
necessarily borne out by research, but I suspect, broadly speaking, that you would, you
mhm.
would find that. So there's gonna be all these cool use cases, but if we just throw them into classrooms,
Yeah.
it's just sort of like jumping into the ocean and kind of like hoping that you kind of find your way. I think like the idea of teachers really being the surfboard, it's like they have that fin, they kind of know the direction that we need to be going, right? And I think they know what like a good classroom and engaging classroom looks like. I
Mhm.
don't think they always necessarily have the bandwidth or the support to actually make that a reality, because we're sort of going to teachers and saying, okay, well, you have all these standards and tests and requirements that you have to do. And then we're also saying, oh, and by the way, we need you to totally sort of like innovate and evolve the classroom for the 21st century.
Yeah.
And it's not always totally feasible. And so my hope is that this journey of AI in education ultimately culminates in, truly empowering teachers to do their best work as educators. And like whether that's game changing tools that increase engagement or literally just things that like reduce the back end workload so that they have like more time to kind of just do deep thinking and, innovative thinking rather than just sort of like doing like rote grading or, lesson planning.
Well, let's get a little bit more deeply into this idea, right? Because you talk about labor and what kind of labor can AI replace? We talk about like what is the future of education in the context of AI, and so like what kinds of problems are AI tools really well suited to solve for in an educational space? And then let's think about like what kind of problems it's creating, but we'll talk about that later. Like what kind of problems do we see? And I know you talked about use cases popping up every day. So I don't expect you to predict the future, but this is a podcast. You're an AI expert, so I do expect you to predict the future. So tell me what kind of problems are we solving for in education with AI, or can we solve for in education?
Yeah, I was just on a call with the ACGSB Air Council and we were talking about this and we're still feeling our way through it.
Yeah.
There's, I think, a lot of like good hypotheses, right? So personalized learning in a general sense is a really clever approach or application of AI because you can, using data about students, really hone in and provide them with, leveled instruction that, allows teachers to reach the full gamut of kids that,
Well, let's sit with that though, Alex. Because all right, so we know Summit Learning, CGI, they had been doing personalized learning for a little bit of time, and
yeah.
the wrap on this is that all these kids sat in front of screens and were taught by algorithms rather than by teachers, and it was very difficult to scale because engagement wasn't that high. So, what about AI will help us do more effective personalized learning than what Summit did? No shade to Summit.
So that is really interesting. And I remember for me, like seeing this image of kids in China, they were in like a gymnasium and cubicles with headphones on,
Yeah,
getting personalized learning. I think,
personalized
I
learning.
think I think personalized learning has been like that as a term, it's been around for a long time. I think when I talk about, like sort of, again, this is specific to large language model enabled personalized learning.
Mhm.
Just to give you an example of what this could look like, one of the schools that we have partnered with, they had it wasn't Conmigo, but it was similar to Conmigo, basically sort of like a helpful tutor or mentor for students that won't just give them the right answer, but help them along the way to get to an answer. And so a math teacher basically reshuffled his math class. So before he would stand in front of the chalkboard, work on equations, the class would kind of sit and watch for about 15, 20 minutes, and then they would break out into groups and work on problems together. And instead of him standing in front of the class for 20 minutes, they use those 20 minutes to actually work on problems individually with their AI tutor. And so
Mhm,
they're getting that kind of like back and forth support. And then the teacher again broke the kids out into groups. And
mhm,
what he saw was engagement was actually way higher. And the kids who really saw like some of the biggest leaps in engagement were the least engaged
mhm,
kids.
right.
And that makes sense intuitively. Like if you're checked out of math class, the teacher standing with his back to you, writing something on the chalkboard is your moment to totally space out. But if you're kind of like one on one and you have kind of this like tutor that's kind of speaking to where you're at in terms of your level of understanding, that probably is going to work better. But importantly, the teacher didn't just say, okay, we're going to hand these kids over to the AI and let it do its thing. It's like the AI was a tool, but it was
Mhm.
still part of that teacher's classroom, right? It
Yeah.
was like,
Mm.
and there was group breakouts, and the teacher, was not stepping out of the ring. And so I think to me, I think AI is going to help teachers deliver these sort of the engaging learning experiences that we're going to have to create for students, because all the skills of the future are skills that you build, I think, interactively in classroom environments, like
Yeah.
critical
Yeah.
thinking and communication and collaboration. Like, I
Come on,
don't know
come
that
on, come
AI
on,
can build
Alex.
those.
Yes. Okay. So there's a lot of things that you said that I really want to elevate. First, one of the biggest problem sets in education is how to effectively differentiate for different levels of students in a classroom, right? Our teachers spend hours and hours on lesson plans because we may have a student with a second grade reading level and a student in the ninth grade reading level. And our teachers spend a lot of time thinking about, well, how do I create a lesson that can be equally engaging and accessible for that huge range, right? At the UA, right, we focus on what we call unscreened education. Here in New York, there are folks who make this argument. The only way to have a high quality education is to group folks by ability across the range of potential and performance, right? So the only way to get into this school is if you can test into this school because we need students of the same ability. Because how am I supposed to teach students across this range? And so when you talk about this notion of differentiation that's enabled by AI, it gives teachers a tool to check in, to work with young people, and to personalize their supports while not necessarily having to spend 6 hours lesson planning individually for all 25 kids or 30 kids in the classroom. I want to really resonate with that. And then you talked about things like collaboration, critical thinking. We'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the future of learning. But that idea of solving like critical problems in public education, one of the critical problems is differentiation in the classroom. And I do agree with you that AI has a lot to play in that space.
Yeah, that resonates with me in certain terms, like, a second grade versus a ninth grade reading level, like, pretty plausible that you could have a class with that gamut
Oh,
of
yeah.
facilities. And,
Yes, you can.
um, and it's not that teachers can't adapt for those kids, but it's just very time consuming to, like, every
Yes.
single lesson. You're now trying to, like, you're basically creating two separate lessons. That's not
Separate
to say that there are
paradigms.
kids in the middle, and then they probably need their own lesson. And so I think as a tool to support teachers and supporting students at different levels,
Yeah.
that's definitely one of the most interesting use cases in terms of, like, what problem can AI solve?
And then let's go back to your space, right? Because the role of content and the role of critical thinking, understanding, communication, and collaboration, right? I want to elevate that from what your response was, because to your point, I got the scene. Did you see Star Trek, the new Star Trek, the reboot way back in like
Yes.
2019?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, of course.
All right. So there's this scene where the little young Spock is in education in a Vulcan school. And he's sitting around, they're asking him these banal facts, and he's like answering them. And it's like, yes. And he just goes around like, yes. And this is supposed to be like the advanced Vulcan way of teaching. And I remember watching this, Alex, and I was like, this is crazy. This is not a high quality education, right? And I remember there's like photon torpedoes and there's warp speed and there's aliens. I was down for all of it. But this scene, I was like, it's broke the fourth wall for me. I could not get beyond that, right? And because we know that purpose of education is helping people understand, right? Not just imbibe information, but understand. And that requires communication, requires collaboration, requires critical thinking. And that needs to happen in the classrooms too. And that's where I think Summit Learning may have not been able to be scaled because some of those implicit concepts were not as scalable as some of the tools that they were using.
Yeah, no word. I mean, this is inevitably gonna come up, but it's like, in a world where content knowledge isn't necessarily a differentiator, the ability to kind of interact with content and knowledge in, like, a strategic way is probably as close as we're gonna get to getting kids ready for the future of work that we don't really know what it's gonna look like. It's not like there's some new set of tools that are gonna get kids ready. It's more along the lines of, we need students to be dealing with the challenges of the one-to-one or three-to-one interactions. There's a lot of learning and social emotional resilience that gets built by having to work in groups, by having to interact with, like, information or problems that they don't quite know how to solve. And I guess where the AI piece almost is, like, I do wonder, is there a level of, like, too much AI where it might become such a crutch
Mhm.
that students won't have to struggle through problems anymore? And I think that's where I draw the biggest pause, is like, you know, there probably is an age where it's too early to introduce an LLM.
Mm.
Now Conmigo, I think, is trying, and other companies like Khan Academy are getting close to sort of honing in on that problem, right? It's like, can you design an LLM that doesn't just give you the answers, that kind of walks you through it?
That's their big
Um,
push, right? Yeah.
so maybe that's a solution, but still, I mean, like Malcolm Gladwell did, talk about this, where actually, you would expect that students in smaller classrooms perform better, but sometimes students in larger classrooms that had less support from teachers ended up doing better overall because you kind of like build this resilience and grit that comes from struggling with problems and not necessarily having that hands-on support. And so if
Yeah.
AI becomes this kind of like, if it makes everything too easy, is that actually good?
This is the question. And so at the UA, the instructional concept that we really spend a lot of time thinking about is productive struggle, right? I got a quick story for you, Alex. So in 1960s, Betty Crocker comes out with cake mix, and they're like, great, cake mix. You don't have to do all the flour and that's measuring. You just put it into the oven. And it doesn't sell at all. It sells terribly because it turns out that people believe that cakes are about love, and putting effort into making your cake is a demonstration of your love. So Petty Crocker goes, they do some focus groups, and they say, if you add an egg, people will do it. And so they added an egg, and people are like, this is great. Now I've saved myself 3 hours baking a cake, but I can add the egg. And when we think about instructional approaches and productive struggle, we think a lot about like, what is the thing that students are adding to the task that engages their thinking? And when we think about the role of AI, the question to me continues to be like, is there a way to continue to refine the ability of young people to think, given that AI could just be the Petty Crocker in a box? It's like, I got a cake, no problem. I guess you can put an egg. It doesn't really matter, but we want you to kind of like engage with our ideas. And so ultimately, to me, this is about understanding and training the human mind to understand relationships effectively, right? Cause and effect, inference. And unless we have enough content to do that, we have people walking around with minds that are untrained and unable to understand the world around them and themselves.
Betty Crocker's interesting. We're going to have to basically raise the bar because if students have access to all these tools, what it might mean is that they're going to be able to create significantly more interesting and cool stuff.
Mhm,
And so, your introduction to computer science class, in the first 2 weeks, you might be designing an immersive 3D video game environment using generative AI. But that's going to be a tough balancing act because, you know, if you raise the bar, you have to ensure that every kid has access to those tools. You can't raise the bar for the kids who have the AI tools and then the kids who don't are just totally left in the dust.
yeah.
So it's gonna be tough. Like we're gonna have to kind of feel this out and make sure that we're moving. And this is like not even up to education to answer overall. It's like even in work, we're doing a lot of hiring.
Mhm,
And I've started to ask myself the question, if I get a cover letter that's less good than what Chat GPT could have written,
mhm.
do I judge that person for not even being willing to use the AI tool? And I think that's like a really important sort of question for society. Like, at what point do we start creating an expectation
Mm.
that we're augmenting our work with these tools versus, right now it seems like we're more experimenting. And in some cases, maybe it's taboo. I'm sure some candidates are afraid to use ChatGPT because they worry that they'll get dinged.
These are the big questions. One of the kind of big philosophical questions that sit in the education space is the role of content versus skills, right? There are some folks on one side who are like, look, you cannot reason without content. Content is what trains our mind to understand. Other folks are on the skill side of the house, and they're like, look, you can train your mind across many kinds of content. It doesn't have to be Shakespeare, it doesn't have to be algebra, right? As long as we're refining our thinking through problem sets, or we're going to produce young people who can understand themselves and the world. And I think the AI kind of conversation, it casts this huge pall over the whole educational idea. Like, what are we doing in our schools and why? I mean, let's just go back. Let's go back, right? So, Library of Alexandria was burned. I think it was burned by some Christians who thought it was pagan and they didn't want the pagan knowledge to be distributed. And back in the day, the book was everything, right? Like if knowledge didn't exist in a book or through oral
Right.
tradition, which is hard to scale, they didn't exist, right? You could just wipe out all of human knowledge just by burning down a library. Then, we got the printing press, then we've got the internet. And then now this notion of the acquisition of knowledge versus the application of knowledge. And we have a tool in AI who not only can acquire knowledge, but apply knowledge to new problem sets that we don't even know that we don't even know. Like you were talking about Farsi. Like, do you think this thing can do Farsi? And they're like, looks like it can. So congratulations, right? So I don't know. I want to spend a little bit more time on this before we get into our lightning round here, Alex, and just thinking about like how do we understand what we're doing in education when the ideas of humankind, to a certain extent, are being scraped and presented to young people as they try and solve problems?
Okay, so content versus skills. This is like an age-old problem. It predates AI, of course.
Yep.
We already kind of encountered the first wave of, let's say, the devaluing of content knowledge, with Google. Content knowledge by itself is not a game changer anymore or a differentiator. But at the same time, I think you benefit, especially in certain careers or in certain spaces, you have to have content knowledge mixed with skills. I don't know that language models really change any of that. I think they give you access to different types of content more readily. But, I think at the end of the day, kids are still going to have to learn algebra. They're still going to have to learn geometry. They're still going to have to learn how to like structure their thoughts and write them down on paper and you utilize outlines. And none of that is going to be replaced by prompt engineering. They might also learn prompt engineering. Candidly, that's probably something that they're going to be building the skills for in, English and social studies and, just it's rhetoric essentially, like how do you elicit an outcome from an agent? I really don't see this as like a moment where education gets wildly disrupted. I
Mm,
think what we're going to find is this is going to be more back to basics because at the end of the day, like the best prompt engineers are people who marry, they're like licensed to experiment. They're willing to sort of like take some risks, make mistakes, but they also have domain expertise, whatever that is. So, and that's why teachers are such powerful users of AI because once you get them to a place where they feel comfortable experimenting, nobody knows education more or nobody knows their classrooms better than the teachers in
mhm,
those classrooms.
mhm,
But when you think about kids, we're sort of building all of this from scratch. They are feeling out their interests and starting to self-identify. Maybe more to the point where there might be a sort of a significant change or disruption is we're going to focus less on like outputs, whether it's like an essay or a research paper or a presentation or a project, and more on the process. Like, how
mhm.
did you actually go about writing that essay? How did you go about creating that business plan or that project? And it's going to be kind of like showing your work in math class. And so I think when teachers are trying to figure out, well, how do I design assessments or take home, or like homework that students can't just use ChatGPT to cheat on. And it's like, well, basically, if you can use ChatGPT to cheat on it, it's probably not rigorous enough. It's probably not homework for the future. So focus less on trying to catch them using ChatGPT and focus more on like, what if you just said you're encouraged to use ChatGPT? Like, what would it look like to create an assignment where you couldn't just totally produce it with an LLM?
I really, really like that because I think going back to this notion of thinking and understanding, right? We want to use all the tools that are possible to understand ourselves, to understand a problem set, to understand the world. And so, how do we construct tasks that allow us to push young people to understand? And this is why I think when we're coming out of the pandemic, we got into this weird thing, Alex, where it's like you learn online, you're using Google Classroom, and we look at the product as the reflection of student learning when in real life, what real teachers do is watch the learning process itself and give students feedback on that learning process, your frustrations, how you move through struggle, how you pull information, how you collaborate with your peers so that they have insight into how that related to the final outcome. So I'm with you on this. I think one of our challenges that we should elevate is if you have an assignment that is chat GPTable, let's up the rigor of that assignment, right? So that we have students thinking. And that's going to bring us to our lightning round. We're going to do a quick question answer, agree, disagree. We're here with Alex Kotran, and he is going to help me to understand some big ideas in AI. We're going to do that through agree and disagree. How are you feeling about that, Alex?
Let's do it.
All right, here we go. Lightning round. Question number one. Agree, disagree with Alex Kotran. Question number one. AI will replace teachers. Agree, disagree, Alex.
Oh, definitely disagree. Yeah, absolutely not.
Disagree. Okay, tell me more.
Disagree. Well, I think AI could replace teachers long term if society allows it to. I think the analogy I use is like the self-checkout machines in grocery stores. You could imagine those companies probably pitched grocery stores on, oh, this is going to make your customer experience amazing. And like, it's going to unlock all this extra capacity for your grocers to be more supportive and like help, patrons with recipes. And it was just used to kind of just like cut costs. But I just believe deeply that parents, students, and educators are like uniformly going to agree that classrooms where students are just sitting in front of computers, no matter how engaging those computers are, nobody's going to want that. And also, I think teachers are always going to be better. Like classrooms where teachers are augmented by AI are going to always be better than classrooms where teachers are replaced by AI.
Appreciate that. All right. So, Alex, AI will not replace teachers unless we let them replace teachers. Teachers are doing more than just putting out information or giving students feedback on their learning styles, the processes. It's about bringing tools in. All right. Second question, lightning round. Question two, agree, disagree. Artificial intelligence will make content knowledge irrelevant. Alex.
Disagree for sure. In a world where everybody has access to AI tools, you still ask the question of like, what's going to differentiate you?
Mm,
And so you want to work as a software engineer. Sure, AI is going to be really good at writing software. It already is quite good today. But in a job market where everybody has access to those AI tools, companies are still going to want somebody that knows a little something about computer science. So if you're trying to go and work at this company with no content knowledge about computer science, you can bet, the farm on the fact that like the kid who actually has spent the time and has the kind of metacognitive computational thinking skills that they built in tandem with the content knowledge about whatever, programming languages they understand, like, they are always gonna be better off. Content knowledge, broadly speaking, and I think people are gonna be better able to participate in debates than they were before because now you can actually get your talking points, but everybody's gonna have access to those same talking points and same tools,
yeah.
so if you wanna win a debate, you still have to know what questions to ask. So, yeah, no, not irrelevant.
I really love your response to this, right? What's gonna be the differentiator? I think that's a really, really cool insight, right? And we're making assumptions here that everybody will have access to the tools.
That's a really good point to call out, and that's where this equity question really, like, comes to a head is, like, we're all assuming that, but we need to call out that, like, that assumption historically has not been addressed.
Yeah. No, I'm with it 100%. And the other thing you said I wanted to elevate here is this question of deeper learning and deeper understanding, right? And if we have a deep understanding of content, we can make kind of connections between things in different ways and ask different kinds of questions. So, what's going to be your differentiator? I like your answer. AI will make content knowledge irrelevant. Alex disagrees. All right, moving to our last agree, disagree. This is focused on personalized learning. Alex Kotran, CEO, AI EDU. Agree, disagree. Artificial intelligence will increase personalized learning in schools. Agree, disagree.
Yeah, I agree, for sure. What I will say is this, I think it's gonna be one of the really interesting problems that people aren't quite wrapping their heads around yet, and that is, we're gonna have the capacity for almost, like, infinitely personalized learning, and that is tantalizing, but I think we need to get comfortable with the fact that in order to personalize learning, we have to give up a lot of information to these tools. And, in a world where the college application essay is no longer, useful anymore, and maybe we even find that certain types of tests are less useful. You know what will probably do the best job determining what school a kid is, ready to, the best fit for? It's going to be their personalized tutor because
Mhm.
that tutor is going to know everything about that kid. It will probably know more about the student than their parents in many cases. And like we've seen this even with like just based on people's posting on Facebook, AI tools are able to score better on a personality test than, close friends or even family members
Mm.
sometimes.
Don't
Um,
tell my wife that, Alex. I have to
yeah.
keep that
So,
between me and Facebook.
but it's like, what happens if, these personalized tutors become like a sorting hat for not just college, but careers?
Mhm.
And like, maybe that's better. Maybe that's more equitable. But I think it's a big decision to take away agency from kids, like, this idea that, like, you can be anything you want if it turns into you're gonna be what the AI determines you're the best fit for is like I mean, there's literally dystopian novels specifically about that, and so, personalized learning needs to be implemented super thoughtfully because it might take time for us to get to that point, but it's kind of easy to see how you could sort of, like, go down this path and it becomes a slippery slope that becomes hard to roll back.
So that concludes our lightning round. And I want to thank you for your deep insight into the spaces. And as we're thinking about personalized learning, you talked about this notion of infinitely personalized learning. And I want to spend some time on this because we've seen how the media fragmentation of our society has narrowed our understanding, going back to this notion of what we're trying to accomplish in the world and education. of media topics, right? Because one's media diet is a good predictor for how we understand the world. And this notion of public schools as a public good, trying to produce something towards the common good and the common outcome, can be belied by an infinitely personalized learning environment. Let me just take a second to be more specific on this, right? So imagine if a student is receiving something so personal that they don't connect to other students in the classroom in terms of what the big ideas are. And imagine if we as a society can't connect communities to each other because we're all getting personalized information, personalized examples. And imagine we can't connect our states and our country to each other because everything is so unique to each other. So as you're talking here, I'm thinking about what's the balance between individual and collective development and what role the public education system needs to play in making that balance, getting that balance as least as right as possible. Because I think we've struggled to do this for a lot of years. And I think it's going to be more difficult when we think about the role of AI and really narrowing what people can understand about themselves and others for the sake of relevance to each individual need.
Hmm. I mean, I'm trying to figure out if I have something really smart to say about this, or I guess, can I just ask a question before I respond?
Yeah, of
D
course.
Like, to what degree is this informed by you? I mean, because you've been talking a lot about some of the work that Urban Assembly has been doing. It's not it maybe wasn't AI before AI, but it was still a lot of the same kind of, like, bigger threads that we're talking about in terms of, like, whether it's personalized learning or, like, supporting teachers or classroom engagement or sort of like that tension between content, knowledge, and skills.
Yeah.
Um, is there something about, like, what you've been experiencing in your own work over the past couple of years that kind of, like, driving that question?
Yeah. I appreciate it. I mean, I think the big idea that's animating that question is we have to have a shared narrative in our country and our communities to connect to each other. And what I've seen in terms of some of the ways we think about our education is when we continue to narrow the story to make it relevant to each individual person, then we don't create a shared story that connects us to each other. And so I'm drawing on the summit, I'm drawing on Spock in Star Trek, but also drawing on this idea that we have an innate want to be told things about ourselves. Like, tell me about myself, I'm happy, right? Tell me about some crazy distant future or history. It takes more effort. And I'm thinking about the role that AI can play or might play in making things so specific that we don't walk away with enduring grand understandings around who we are as a collective society or collective humanity. We're focused on who we are, Alex, who we are, David. And that balance is something that's on my mind. Thank you for asking the question.
Yeah, okay, so, man, this is really profound stuff. There's a lot of times people ask me to kind of, like, prognosticate about what the future will look like, and I think this question kind of hits on something where I'm just gonna say, "Look, I don't really know the answer." I think there's just a lot of introspection that we're gonna have to do as a society, and it's gonna be driven by the specific use cases. I mean, the big elephant in the room is, like, we have no sense of how powerful these models are gonna be in, like, 6 to 8 years. And that's not that far if you think about, you're a freshman in high school, you're 4 to 8 years away from your first job. You're what, 10 to 15 years away from from having kids. I mean, like, there's a lot of room for these tools to get incredibly powerful. And so, like, this big picture question about what is it gonna be like to exist as an individual in a society where, you know, maybe our individuality is like, I don't know if I buy that AI is gonna make us less connected to one another. I mean, it probably will, in the sense that if we just spend all day talking to AI boyfriends and girlfriends and chatbots, which is a
I,
plausible
I've
outcome,
heard
like,
Japan is a thing, but that's not a thing in some countries.
it's a thing in China. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised to hear if it's a thing in Japan as well, because, and those countries are often sort of like further ahead than us in terms of technology implementation. So I think there's lots of ways that AI could make us more isolated, even if we're getting more personalized engagement. But at the same time, I think, AI could actually, if it's deployed in the right way, it could make it easier to interact with people that you don't know or don't understand, because it's quite good if you go to ChatGPT and say, "Hey, I'm a teacher. I'm about to start at a school in the Bronx, to a classroom that's mostly Black, and I could use some help just figuring out, and I'm white, and I could use some help figuring out how to just sort of, like, connect with these kids." You'll probably get some pretty good ideas.
Mm.
And so I think that there's definitely a world where AI actually is like becomes a tool for encouraging those connections. But
And but
it's like the people
that's not
are
just
going to
gonna
be
be
decide this. We are going to decide based on how we use the tools. The tech companies won't be able to solve this for us. So it's really a normative question about like how do we structure society around these tools in a way that isn't like undermining what it means to be human. I guess
so
that.
I mean, there's important things there, right? So on the one hand, right, I think your example is really interesting because one way to think about how to connect with folks from different spaces is to talk to them, right? And connect with them in different spaces. And this is going back to that. How are we using these tools? And were we using AI to give us a general kind of big norm of what people think Black kids are like, or are we just talking to the kids in the classroom? And I think that's where I just have some interest in that, Alex. And you're right. How we use it will matter. And this is the last question we have for today, right? One of the ideas is how we use AI to pursue the common good versus commercialism, which has different value sets behind it, right? The commercialism tends to have value sets that are focused on feeding us information that we already want to hear. And that's what engagement is related to. Facebook has done a lot of research on what engages people. And surprise, surprise, things that they want to hear and things that they already like. And let's contrast that with the common good, which is often how do we engage in ideas that are different with people who are different in constructive ways. I just want to take some time here in this last question thinking about commercial use of AI, social good, social value use of AI, and what are some mechanisms, what are some policies, what are some ideas that we have to balance that trade-off a little bit more effectively.
Hmm, it's a good question. I mean, we're funded by a lot of technology companies that contributed to building the internet, and so I'm gonna sort of speak in generalities here. But I think if you look at sort of the development of the internet, it was primarily driven by commercial use cases, and there are good and bad outcomes from that. I think there's been like amazing outcomes in terms of connectivity and access to knowledge and new businesses. And I'm a big YouTube fan, and there's all these amazing creators on YouTube who are just like have a platform that they never had before. And then there's also like all the challenges that come with social media. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge that like, you know, there's no blanket statement to be said like, oh, commercial uses of technology are going to be bad. And, I don't even know what AI for the common good necessarily means. I mean, I guess you could say, well, like nonprofit, your Urban Assembly is a nonprofit, AIEDU is a
Nonprofit.
nonprofit. So I think in the abstract, finding ways for social, civil society organizations, universities to have access to AI tools is critical. But, how would we accomplish that? It's probably going to be in partnership with these commercial companies.
Yeah.
Um, you could imagine government grants, but I don't know how plausible that really is going to be. I think it's going to be something like government grants to like fund, but also advancements in the models that allow costs to come down. And that's going to primarily be a market driven
Yes.
force. Is like the real reason costs are going to come down is not because it's important for nonprofits to get access to the tools, it's because companies are going to be competitive, more competitive if their models are cheaper. So to me, it's like figuring out how do we make sure that there's at least like the incentive structure so that companies, as they're working on these like market solutions with AI, that we're also keeping in mind how those solutions can be adapted and implemented for social good. And then also just, I think generally like how do we cultivate and attract, smart, amazing, diverse minds to build these tools because, right now it's a trope. It's very common. It's like people complaining about the lack of diversity in tech. And being someone in San Francisco, I can firsthand attest to that. People talk about it a lot because it really is a problem. It's like, you kind of sit where you stand. And if you can't empathize with some of like sort of these core societal problems that need to be solved, you're probably not going to be effective in like ideating solutions for those problems. And so I don't have an answer to how we get there, but I think part of this is just like, more hands is better than fewer.
Well, Alex, we started off with your story of how AI EDU came to be. You talked a little bit about your background and communications and community organizing. Then we talked about the national journey of what AI has been and could be. We went to our lightning round where you were pretty agree, and I think a disagree in terms of the future of AI. And then we spent some time thinking about the promise of AI vis-a-vis the common good. What I heard you say is that you are optimistic that one, taking commercial uses of AI and having folks like you and folks who have a vision around this for the common good will help us take those incentives and play them out in real life in ways that contribute to who we are as a nation and who we are in the education space. And so we've been having a conversation here about what AI could be and what AI is. And it's been a pleasure to just hear about how you think about the work moving forward and what your journey has been. So let me give you the last word here, Alex. Your sense of the future for AI, optimistic, pessimistic, 2 years from now, what do you see the future of AI in education?
I don't want to sugarcoat it. Look, I'm actually really, I don't know if I'm pessimistic. I'm very concerned.
Mm,
And I'm not concerned about really like AI in education. I think we're going to get better and better at using the tools, and we'll figure out the guardrails and all that. What I'm concerned about is AI is going to create dramatic upheavals in the workforce, and everything we thought we knew about career pathways is going to change. And it's not going to change for like niche careers. It's going to change for like bedrock knowledge work, design, mathematics, business, writing. And I worry that schools are going to be caught off guard, that society, broadly speaking, is going to be caught off guard.
mm,
And I'm excited about the fact that I think what we've seen over the last year is educators all over the country really like honing in on this problem and like wanting to be part of the solution and like being super engaged. I think more engaged than anybody really expected. Talk to anybody that's done an AI education conference, and what they'll tell you is like rooms are literally filled to the brim. You know, the last 5 presentations we've given,
yeah.
standing room only, the educators are literally pouring into the hallway. So, that's really encouraging. The fact that, the one cohort in society that we need to be engaged on this, educators, like they are.
Yeah.
So it's a big challenge, but if we can solve it, it's very possible, if not likely, that we're going to be able to like expand access to prosperity in a way that we weren't able to before. But that's definitely not a given, and we have to get away from talking about this as, well, jobs are going to be created, jobs are going to be destroyed. It's just going to work itself out. Like it's not just going to work itself out if we are not super intentional about, making sure that there's like equitable access to this future. Because what we've experienced in the past was there were kids at the front of the line and there were kids at the back of the line. Like, is the private school kids in the front of the line? It was like the well-funded, public school, suburban public schools. And if you were in a low income community, if you were Black or brown, if you were an English language learner, it took you a decade to get access to broadband and to all this stuff. And at that point, it was like you were always trying to run from behind. And if we repeat that with AI, which is an order of magnitude more powerful,
Mm.
it's the biggest paradigm of equity for our generation, maybe even in the history of education. So it's like the stakes are high.
Wow. Well, let's leave it with that. Thank you, Alex, for your time. Thank you for your effort on behalf of public education. Thanks for bringing the AI project here to New York City. I know you're working with New York City educators as well as educators across the country. And we'll take that challenge, right? The biggest paradigm in the history of education. We're going to take it straight on and we're going to get ourselves a good surfboard so that we can ride that wave and make sure that we ride it to the destiny that our students deserve. So we're looking forward to making this work and working with partners like you to make it happen.
All right, surf's up.
Thanks for listening to our latest episode of Innovations in Education, where we bring education leaders who have made things work in the education sector. If you like this episode, please subscribe so that you can hear more great content around innovations in education. I've been your host, David Adams. Have a great day.